So now we're going to unpack some of the assessment concepts. So we're going to focus on the difference between an assessment tool to an assessment instrument and an assessment report. So an assessment tool is essentially the procedure, okay? So this is what you would validate, that whole overall procedure of conducting assessment. So the procedures for gathering and interpreting evidence for planned assessment methods. And the tool can include instructions, resources, special arrangements, and that would usually be occurring within the assessment plan, and also the instruments for gathering evidence. So let's make this easier for you to understand with a concept that you know. So think of the module that you're doing now. That essentially is an assessment tool because the YouTubes contain the instructions, there's written resources, there's YouTube visual lecture resources, there's all sorts of resources within that module. And there's also instruments for gathering evidence because we've got the satisfactory and not satisfactory marker guides on that right hand side. So now we're going to look at the instruments more closely within that. So the instruments are actually the things that target the evidence. They're the devices. So let's keep going, thinking about our modules here at Evoke. So some of the instruments we have questions. So we have the written questions, and then we have some self-assessment that came up in Module 2. There was a lot of self-reflection, and even though that was prompted with a question, there was areas there available within that tool. So the tool had the instruction or the procedure, you know, certainly where it had the orange tasks. Let's actually stop and have a look at that. So here we are, here's the instrument. That was the question instrument, and it had the marking guide, so satisfactory or not satisfactory. But there was also the instruction, which formalizes all of this module into a tool. Okay, so we had very clear procedural instructions there. Then we went ahead with the device that targets what we're going to assess, which is the instrument, the question. And then the question had the marking guide. Now, we would have an assessor marking guide, and we would have the correct answers there in a red text. So that sort of comprises the whole thing. Let's have a look what else we've got here. Got the question instruments. Now, here's a task. Okay, so this was a structured activity, and we had very specified instructions for that task. So that's another instrument. That's a structured activity instrument. And again, we would have a marking guide as to the performance measure, you know, what would be considered satisfactory. And again, we have the marking guides here that would allow us to know whether those instruments were satisfactory or not yet satisfactory. There was also a portfolio of evidence that we embedded into our tool. So here's one piece of work evidence. So this was a structured activity where we were able to create a real working document, okay? And that was embedded. So here, all of the different instruments have been embedded into the tool with its procedures, with its instruction, with its marking guides, and we had a separate copy of this, which was the assessor guidelines that our assessors can access, and that shows the full range of performance measures for satisfactory or not satisfactory. So I hope that gives you a good context to understand the difference between the overall tool, i.e. the module, and then the instruments contained within that module or tool. And now we're going to introduce another concept. This is the assessment report. So we keep these here at Evoke, and record all of your modules in individual assessment reports. And different RTOs will have different policies for how they need to record and determine the outcome of competency. So before I show you our assessment report, I don't want you to panic, because your RTO that you go and work for might construct this completely differently. But essentially, so long as every assessment document is contained somewhere in a file for your candidate, and you are able to show at validation or under an ask or audit that you have an assessment plan, that you can clearly show who the assessors were, that there's either a summary of evidence or copies of all of the assessment events, all of the instruments, okay? That you can show how you've recorded the assessment decision, that you've justified that, you know, through your validation, through your mapping. So you've actually been able to map it back through to all of the components of the unit and mapped it through to employability skills. And if I'm losing you, just hang on for a minute, because I will show you visually how we do this with our assessment report. And finally, you have to, within that file, you would have to show that there is feedback that you've given to the candidate, or records of any appeals, or the outcomes of that feedback process. Sometimes the outcome is simply they were found competent and they were awarded with a qualification. And finally, you have to show how the assessors have signed off on that. So usually an RTO will have an actual document called an assessment report. And we're just going to quickly show you the assessment report at Evoke. So here's our assessment report on Module 4. So we're very clearly given the scope of what is contained. So in Module 4, it's only one unit. Usually the modules were clustered, you know, they were integrated with other units, but Module 4 was a separate elective unit on its own, because in July 2014 it becomes core and part of it. So we needed to create something that was flexible, that will work for people that are approaching us just to upgrade to LLN, and include it as an additional module for people that are undergoing their qualification. So that's why there's a separate one for this, as opposed to our integrated units within the other three modules. Okay, so we have the candidate's name clearly written, and we've ticked off the fact that we have the assessor details on there. So our assessment report contains the assessment plan, which gives all of the personal details of the candidate, the date, the time, the venue of the assessment, etc., any special needs. And then our assessment report contains mapping. So if we were to go to an external validation and they wanted to make sure that, you know, that we had met all of the components of the unit, we have included a very detailed mapping, and that's something, you know, the mapping is what the RTO keeps pretty close to your chest, because it takes a long time and a lot of expertise to develop mapping. So ours contains the mapping. Then we've got the tools, which you know is the modules. Then we contain the report, and finally the feedback. So let's see how all of that pans out. I'm just going to jump ahead. I've got a little hyperlink here. So the assessment plan contains the purpose of the assessment. Some people will be going for recognised prior learning, so that would be to recognise the current existing competence, and that would drive what types of instruments you would use. Or if they're taking a learning and assessment pathway, you would establish if competence is achieved following learning. So one's an RPL or perhaps an assessment only, and one is following learning. So we have different purposes for assessment. Then we have the context, and this is not new to you. You've come across this part of the assessment plan before. Plus we have an area there for any learner support that was needed. Then we talk about the methods that we negotiated with the candidate. So if it's the standard modules, that's all been pre-designed and built in, but sometimes candidates say, well look, I've started working through the module, but I think I've got a lot of evidence myself, so we might then build in some real work activities that they can contribute. So yeah, so that's quite flexible there. Some of the other types of assessment methods, and the famous mapping. So we actually take each unit and we modify that because we have the electronic version from training.gov.au, and we tick off for each performance criterion. I'll just share a little bit with you. There's just a little bit of performance criterion 1.1. So you can see that we've designed our tools that there's an observation. It's an indirect observation because you guys have created the evidence and then submitted it as a one-job lot, but it's still an observation. And there's questions and there's products. So you've actually created some structured activities with whether it's John's assessment plan or Susan's or whatever. So we can see then that there's a range of assessment methods used in order to meet that performance. So that's just a bit of an idea, and then we've gone quite detailed within each one. So you can see that, you know, we've really modified what was originally there in that training.gov.au Word version of that unit of competency. So it's very, very clear to an ASQA auditor or to any external or internal validation that we can thoroughly prove that we've met the components of the unit. And that's what we mean here about justification and mapping and validation. Next on the report, we've contained the mapping that shows how the activities have developed and assessed the employability skills, and some validation background information around that table. Next in the report, we build in our portfolio of evidence. This is where we embed your module that you submit. So again, for revision, there's your question instrument and there's the marking guide. Okay, and we have all of the other assessment methods contained within your assessment tool here, your module. So after that, we go into the next step. And this is the table we use to record that assessment decision. So based on the module, based on the fact that they're all fully satisfactory in the questions, in the embedded documents, which is the product, once all of that is satisfactory, then we could deem them competent. Okay? If there was some issues with it, if there was some areas that weren't yet satisfactory, that's when we would highlight not yet competent, and we would give some information back through to the candidate there and give you an opportunity to resubmit until eventually that was competent. So if there was further evidence required, we would actually write that in the feedback. So here's some information about a post-assessment interview. So if they're competent, our process is we just issue a testament. So if it's the statement of attainment in Module 4, or if we need to combine the 4 assessment reports for the 4 modules so we can issue the qualification, if all are competent, then a testament or the qualification is issued, or the statement of attainment. So if it's not yet competent, then we need to have that interview with you, or an email correspondence, as I said, and discuss that. and then you would put the date of that interview and some information and feedback from the candidate. And so what we would do in that instance is we would then have you either email back that you agree, and then we'd put a copy of the email here, or if we could, probably get the candidate's signature. So that covered the candidate feedback, and finally you need that sign-off. And you can see here on this assessment report, the supervising assessor has actually signed off. So you may have a beginning assessor manage, the simple assessment instruments where there's a very clear-cut, multiple choice, very definite decision on whether it's, the questions are satisfactory or not. But then you would have your supervising assessor come and randomly check or work directly with them to make sure that that's complete, and the supervising assessor signs off.